to whatever extent we started this conversation talking about, is it okay to, be in right-wing spaces or talk to Republicans and stuff? I think that's good, man. And especially,
well, it's not I want to be really clear. It's not the being in the right-wing space. I've been trying to really I was trying to explain this to my mom. When I'm in a left space, here's an example. Here's an example I used for my mom. We had planned a segment for today that we didn't have time for, about new reporting that Robbie found, and I haven't vetted it because we didn't end up doing it. But reporting that suggests that after the IRS got that funding boost in 2022, that they are continuing to disproportionately audit poor people, right? And the argument back then was that some people on the left made, although even back then the left was divided on this. But the argument that I was making was that at a time when the IRS was funded more, they were able to hire more of the auditors that work on high-end expensive accounts, like who audit rich people, basically. And that the return on the investment for auditing rich people is terrific because it's like $6 for every $1 you spend actually auditing them, but that it takes a lot more work. And so when you defund the IRS, you're basically only able to do low-level audits of poor people who haven't spent money on a bunch of lawyers to hide their money. And you get an asymmetry that disproportionately hurts the poor. Now, the right was saying, don't fund the IRS because it hurts the poor. Right. The real reason, I would argue, that they're saying don't fund the IRS is because they don't want the rich people to be gone after.
Obviously.
Now, but the left was divided. Some people were like, no, the IRS goes after the poor. I agree the IRS shouldn't go after the poor. And if new reporting suggests that they haven't turned it around sufficiently and aren't disproportionately going after the rich, a lot of people are going to be really validated, feel confirmed in those arguments. So if this were discussed on Rising, I would feel like my back is up against the wall. Because if I were making this argument by myself on my show, I would frame it as, it's horrible that the IRS has always gone after the poor. We need to change that. Here's how it needs to be. And the Biden administration needs to put like some kind of cap on the incomes of the people that they audit until they were able to turn around these. And I would completely own the argument, right? I would present myself as someone who shared that interest of not having the IRS disproportionately target the poor. And I would say, here's my plan for doing so. If it happens on Rising, if we end up doing this segment on Rising, Robbie's going to frame it as, I told you so. They never should have funded the IRS to begin with. And I'm going to be stuck making an argument about how, well, have they had enough time to turn it around? There needs to be new policy requirements for the funding to make sure they don't go after X, Y, and Z. And it's going to sound like I'm weak and in the middle, trying to tread water and make excuses. And I'm going to come off as being for the IRS going after the poor. I just am. Because I've been in this position 1,000,001 times and I'm honestly like exhausted by it and tired of it. And it makes the right-wing person, the right chair, if you will, seem very principled and simple in their argument of, okay, the IRS is going after the poor and so therefore they are bad. So it's not the fact of talking to a right-wing audience that I have a problem with, or a conservative-leaning audience, or a moderate independent audience. It is what happens when you're forced to have a sort of reactive politics because you're responding to somebody else's framing at least half the time, as opposed to positioning yourself as owning an understanding of the fundamental crisis as a leftist.
Well, I don't know. I'm not a podcast host, but like who gives a damn about convincing a right-wing podcast host of something? Like what matter? I would much rather convince a right-wing voter. Well,
that's the point. It's the audience I'm concerned about, not right, Robbie. Okay, it's the audience.
So forget the hosts and the only arguments we're obligated to make are honest arguments. The honest argument is the Republican Party is an institution that exists to serve the rich, and that's why they're cutting IRS funding, because they don't want to audit rich people. That's the beginning and end of the honest portion of that argument. Now, I think that there are millions of Americans who vote Republican because they are misled, ill-informed. Most people in this country are ill-informed. It's hard to keep up with all this stuff. I mean, we're professional. Our job is to be in the media, and it's a full-time job to try to keep up with this stuff. So millions of people are vulnerable to bad faith arguments. But I also believe, and have seen, and I'm sure you have too, that you can approach a Republican voter, if not a podcast host, and be like, look, who wins? Who wins, for example, from the policy of defunding the IRS? And there are good numbers that show who gets audited and who doesn't get audited, and who cheats on their taxes, and the scale of tax cheating. I mean, Gabriel Zuckman has built a career on this. Like, there's good evidence for this stuff. And people who have conversations in good faith and are interested in the issues in good faith can be persuaded by honest arguments. I guess that's the best answer I have.
Yeah, and maybe I'm not doing a good enough job of trying to convey what it is that I experience. It just feels to me sometimes like I'm spending a lot of time making arguments coming from behind, making arguments that are so responsive. And I have very little time to, one, talk about the things I want to talk about, and also to frame the things that we do end up talking about on the show in a way that I think is ideal for me, as opposed to always having to contend with sometimes what I perceive, obviously subjectively, to be bad faith arguments, but that take time away from making the affirmative case. Like today we were talking about the new student debt stuff, and I would love to spend more time saying that this is less than what he promised. I have my own criticism of Joe Biden on the student debt, but I also just want to tell people, well, here is something, and here's if you can take advantage of it. Like, here's if it applies to you. And there's almost no room to just cover the law, to cover the new policy, because we are sucked into this conversation of, well, do people even deserve student debt relief for the umpteenth time? And that's a conversation that has to happen. If you are with someone that's politically to your right, you are going to end up having that fundamental conversation over and over and over again without creating space for, well, look at what is possible. Look at the realm of the possible that Joe Biden even is making available to you right now.
Yeah.
Do you even want it? Do you want to know what?
You should just do your own show, and then you can attract the, I don't know.
Well, this is it, Hamilton.
This is it. It's great. It's going great. I have to think in terms of like internet comments, which is my version of this. And, I wrote on the internet for a long time, and I learned early on that like there'll be a million internet comments, and like some of them will just be people who are misinformed and saying stupid things, and you can ignore those people. And some of them are people who are talking in bad faith and trying to set these rhetorical traps and try and distract you and trying to make you waste your time and trying to make you spend all day citing your sources and blah, blah. And it's all in bad faith. And you just set those to the side and move ahead, because otherwise it is true. They can suck the life force out of you. And I assume that goes for podcasts too.
You're speaking to your experiences in the trenches of the Gawker universe?
In the trenches of the blog world. Yeah.
The blog world. Yeah. And that's how I first came to know you. And I appreciate those insights, because I don't think it's entirely wrong or off. I think maybe my concerns here are a little bit niche, and I could appreciate that. But the reason it's of a concern to me is particularly in the realm of immigration, although this tax thing was another example of where I saw some slippage happening on the left. Another area is perhaps some speech issues that I think are kind of asymmetrically attended to, not by leftists per se, but by people on the right in a way that I think is exploitative. But regardless, I appreciate you coming here to talk to me specifically about specifically about labor and immigration, because I do think that labor is one of the issues that does get short shrift when things seem really chaotic and pressing at any given time. Speak to me a little bit about this book that you've written.
I wrote a book called The Hammer: Power, Inequality, and the Struggle for the Soul of Labor. It's a book about the labor movement. It's about the potential that the labor movement has to fix a lot of the biggest problems that are undermining America. Some of the problems that we touched on today, particularly inequality and this political divide that we have, and also why the labor movement has failed to do that, why the labor movement is broken in some ways, has not lived up to its potential, and how to change that. And it's reported all over the country. There are many different chapters on many great unions all over the place. The book follows Sarah Nelson, head of the flight attendants union, throughout, talks about her struggle with the question of being a labor movement leader. And I'm pretty bad at describing it, as you can tell, but I would say if you're interested in the labor movement, or if you've thought about this political divide that seems unbridgeable, and you wonder if there is a way for us to move past this, I would urge you to think about the labor movement, and maybe the book is useful for that.
Why do you think it's broken? Why do you think Well, why do you think it's broken? And I do wonder, not to drag this back into the electoral realm, but I do wonder to what extent you feel optimistic about Joe Biden's participation on a picket line and some of the other actions that people have led people to describe him as the most pro-labor president of all time, or if you feel like the Democratic Party itself has played a significant role in the failure of the labor movement to grow and achieve the kinds of gains it would hope to achieve.
Both things are probably true. I mean, it's definitely the case that 50 years of rising inequality, being the kind of macro trend driving people to turn their attention once again to the labor movement that's been beaten down for many, many years since the middle of the 20th century. And also the acute trend of the pandemic, which left tens of millions of American workers going through this overnight crisis of either unemployment or of being deemed essential workers and having to risk their lives and getting a $2 an hour raise that lasted 3 months and seeing their coworkers get sick. I mean, those things put together have led to this kind of moment for organized labor, and public opinion polls will show you that organized labor is more popular than it's been in 60 years, and it's a result of those things. And Joe Biden, when Joe Biden says that he's the most, pro-union president of our lifetime, that's true, but it's also extremely low bar. I mean, the bar is very, very low because even the Democratic, even Obama and Clinton and Carter didn't do much for organized labor. And so he has been good on organized labor. We are in a real moment of potential to turn around that decline of unions that's been going on for so long. And that is, being driven by corporations and corporate power and global capitalism. I mean, it's a very deliberate project of them to try to eradicate unions in America. So it's an exciting time for organized labor. It's also, there's a big risk that organized labor is going to blow this chance because they've gotten weak. They've gotten very disparate. They kind of have gotten institutional and bureaucratic in many senses. And so there's a lot of energy at the grassroots of the labor movement. And, one thing I do hope people take away is like, when you start to feel that sense of like, oh my God, politics is so broken. And it gives us all a little bit of hopelessness, look at the labor movement, because the labor movement is one of the most inspiring and useful movements in America that can pull you out of that muck that politics can put us in sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do wonder, just to follow up there, you mentioned sort of, I don't think you used this term of business unionism, perhaps, and the role that kind of the corruption of unions themselves has played in undermining their successes. And I do wonder, I have found myself looking at something like the uncommitted movement and visualizing it as a sort of bolus of voters who have been organized under an idea as opposed to in a workplace, who have said, I will vote for you. I'm showing you that I can go to the polls. I can vote for you, but only if you change on this policy issue, if you support a ceasefire in Gaza, a permanent ceasefire. And it makes me think about the power of that real concrete leverage and how that used to be the power of unions in these electoral contexts, and whether or not that power has been significantly diminished by this kind of vote blue no matter whoism. There seemed to be some promise that Sean Fain, for instance, was going to hold out. He was delaying his endorsement of Joe Biden, but he ultimately did. The UAW had also come out in favor of a ceasefire, but what does it mean to be pro-ceasefire and also endorsing a president who now still, but especially then, was very, very far from even saying the word ceasefire, much less a permanent ceasefire. I mean, what do you make of that?
On one hand, it's been encouraging to see the coalition of unions that has come out for ceasefires. I mean, at this point, the majority unions representing most of the union members in America have come out for a ceasefire at this point. And there's a coalition, Labor for Ceasefire, that is, it's not just a bunch of lefties. It is many of the biggest and strongest unions in America are in this coalition. And so they are, and, I know that there are people inside that coalition who are pursuing ways to push the White House on the issue. So like, it is being worked on within the labor movement, and that's good to see. On the question of endorsements, I think that endorsement is a blunt tool in this case because Trump would like to eradicate unions from the face of the earth, you know? So the UAW was always going to endorse Biden. There was never any scenario under the sun where the UAW would not endorse Biden, because if Trump wins, it's going to be very, very bad for not just unions, but for working people in America, period. And so, endorsements, I think, are not the tool that we need. What we need is to grow the power of the labor movement by organizing millions of new workers. The labor movement today, only 10% of Americans are union members. That's not enough. When we talk about pushing the Democratic Party where we want it to go, you can't push the Democratic Party where you need to go with only 10% of the workforce in unions.
And yet we're seeing uncommitted with a very small fraction of the vote. I mean, it's much bigger than what they thought was going to be. So I don't mean to diminish them at all, but what has caused the Democratic Party's head to spin on its axis is getting 10, 11, 12, 13% of the vote in some of these states, right? So we're talking 100,000 votes in Michigan, but 47,000 votes in Wisconsin. But that's significant. It's twice as many votes as Biden won by in 2020, and that Hillary lost by in 2016. So there does seem to be some asymmetry there. And again, I completely appreciate what you're saying about Donald Trump. I don't want to diminish that at all. But when sometimes I hear kind of labor folks talk about the need to grow labor, I also hear in the back of my head a very similar argument about how we need to grow independent parties. And it seems to me that there's a kind of simpatico there, where a world where, let me put it this differently. There's a world where we understand that there can be incremental labor gains that build on it themselves and are useful even if they don't result in a victory tomorrow, right? No, what's the Michael Levy book called? No shortcuts. There's no shortcuts, right? We say that all the time in the labor context. And the electoral context, it almost feels like, well, if the Green Party or whatever the left third party doesn't win, it was a waste of everybody's time. There's no sense that, well, if a party like that were able to get a labor endorsement and slowly start to chip away and get a larger and larger piece of the voting mass, of voters interested, then you could start to exercise real leverage politically, and eventually perhaps even have a world where we have an option for a party that just doesn't not kill labor like Trump would, but genuinely invest in it as a priority as a party.
I mean, historically speaking, the question of having a labor party has been, for 100 years, the labor movement has been talking about that. And that's been a debate within the labor movement since before World War II. There's always been a faction of people that want to start a labor party. And I mean,
why not?
I guess I care about outcomes more than parties. I mean, it is unavoidable in a two-party system that a third party on the left that's not strong enough to win helps Republicans. I mean, that's the design of the system. So when I think of third parties, I look at DSA. I like what DSA is doing. DSA is building power, grassroots power, municipal power, running for city elections. I mean, they're putting people in Congress. That's a path that I can see being useful. Is it useful to launch? I don't know. I haven't given a ton of thought to third parties, I guess, mostly because I'm more concerned with the outcome. If we can push the Democratic Party to where I think it needs to be, then that's fine with me. I don't care what stamp is on it. And a good thing about growing the labor movement is that the stronger unions get, unions can accomplish the policy outcomes that people on the left want, even without going through electoral politics, so we can raise wages, we can protect the working class, we can do all those things, and we don't have to, it's not dependent on who's in Congress, and it's not dependent on who's in the White House. It's dependent on the power workers themselves. Do
you think a Democratic Party that was a NAFTA, Bill Clinton Democratic Party, a Democratic Party with a president that says he would veto Medicare for all if it came across his desk, healthcare being such a huge issue in union negotiations. Do you think a party for whom Joe Biden is the most pro-union president in our lifetimes, and that's an indictment of said party, is a party that really is going to be able to shepherd through the kind of world we want to see? I mean, it seems to me that the critique that was made, that was kind of foregrounded of the Democratic Party through kind of the 2016 Bernie movement and the 2018 kind of squad movement that came up after it was that it was fundamentally flawed, that its agenda, its goals, its intention were irredeemable, and that we had to do something else, that we had two corporate parties. They're the wings of one neoliberal bird. And the project of the squad as to how much you can influence it from the inside has been perceived by many to be a failure, not necessarily because of any personal feeling of any individual person, but the institutional obstacle of being able to be adversarial without finding yourself up against an AIPAC challenge or being browbeat on the House floor by Nancy Pelosi or any of the other kinds of coercion that they've experienced during their time there.
I mean, I'm not here to defend the Democratic Party. I don't give a fuck about the Democratic Party, and I voted for Bernie. But what I would say is like a third party doesn't solve the problem because the problem is in the structure of our political system. So, the Senate, in which every state gets equal representation, that is a structural problem that has the effect of institutionalizing conservative power and marginalizing, millions of voters. Like, that's something that a third party is not going to fix. There's campaign finance. I mean, the electoral college, something that is inherently anti-democratic is not something that a third party is going to fix. So I would be all for tearing up our political system and rebuilding it in a way that is actually representative of the United States of America. But I don't know that just starting a third party is going to accomplish that. I think just starting a third party in the current system is going to get Republicans elected.
What I fantasize about is a third party that has to exist before it can make these arguments, but a third party which, after it exists, because people believe in it and yes, and it, instead of saying it cannot work, advocates for ranked choice voting, which gets to your concern about the spoiler effect, which I would challenge, by the way, and which I think is it's a major party problem. It's not our problem. And if you make it your problem, then you are going to end up being forced into a vote blue no matter who, vote blue no matter who for the rest of your life. But that's neither here nor there. A third part, a Labor Party, if you want to call it, that advocate that runs ads during campaign season that talk about what the needs and desires of labor is, that criticizes both parties to the extent that they've been antithetical to those efforts, that criticizes, let's say, Joe Biden for abandoning the measly $15 minimum wage back in 2021, that tells the truth about those kinds of issues that the two-party system won't, and slowly starts to educate the public that another option is available, thereby forcing the two major parties to either get in formation or fail. We have had a successful third party effort in the United States of America, and it's the Republican Party that elected Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And it is bizarre. And it happened at a moment when there was so much cultural tension over the issue of slavery and what this country was going to look like on some of these big ticket economic and moral issues, that there was a realignment. And so I'm optimistic about that, but it does seem sometimes like I am the only one who seems to think that that's a priority. And sometimes I got to be honest with you, Hamilton, I feel like the biggest obstacle to those kind of changes happening, so there's absolutely no appetite for it on the left.
Well, that's, I think I'm sure we share the same goals, right? And it sounds to me like DSA is probably the closest existing thing to what you're talking about.
Well, no, because they have specifically said that they don't want to be a party apparatus.
But, for you, if you are an enthusiast of starting a third party, you have to answer the question of like, where's all your members? Because that is the same, by the way, the same question that the labor movement has to answer. We have to have the people. If we want the power, we got to have the people. So if you believe in this solution, you got to be like, where's the people at,
Yeah, that's part of why I think this is the question I brought up in the context of labor and what they're doing and with these endorsements, because I think that energy could be put toward helping to build a party that actually represents their interest, that is mutually beneficial back and forth, right? A group of workers that supports a party and a party that's designed to support those workers. But as long as everyone's like, well, the Democrats are the best, we got to vote for Democrats at the end of the day, where all of that political energy, the political energy from the Bernie campaigns, the political energy from the UAW strikes, from the Amazon strikes, all of that just dissipates into the ether because there's no receptacle in terms of a long-standing institution that outlasts any political cycle.
I think we probably share a lot of the same concerns. I think about this in terms of building organized labor. I think maybe the way that you think about a third party, I think about building the labor movement, because the labor movement is a permanent institution. Unions are permanent institutions that exist through decades in time, no matter who's in the White House. And if we can strengthen unions and organized labor in general, you can build a power base that sits outside of the two parties, and whether you have a labor party or not, if you have strong organized labor, they can make their priorities come true,
But
So
didn't you just say that no matter what, Hamilton, they have to endorse Democrats because the Republicans want to wipe unions off of the map?
I didn't say no matter what. I said that's the situation today.
So, what's going to change? That Republicans are going to suddenly be super pro-union, and so then labor, unions won't have to endorse Democrats?
I would say, like, when Joe Biden got elected, I didn't think Joe Biden was going to do very many good things. I didn't have a high opinion of Joe Biden. And I will admit that I have been surprised to some extent, and in some policy areas, obviously not in others. But Joe Biden has done more progressive things than I thought he would do.
But that's not quite my question.
Okay, but that is the effect. That's an effect of pushing the Democratic Party, right? It's not because Joe Biden is a great guy. It's because he was pushed by forces within the Democratic Party, which are progressive forces. So, like, that's the mechanism. If a third party would do that better, I'm all for it. I'm just not sure I buy that a third party would do it better.
I do sometimes feel like I have labor guests on, and it's not intentional. Nobody's doing it on purpose, but there is this like circular kind of conversation we can get into where it's like, we can't really do anything because labor isn't big, and labor isn't big because why? I don't know. We just have to keep trying harder. Right. And I understand, I'm not saying that things happen overnight. I'm not, a child. I understand how the world works, but it also is true that we are faced with all of these really unique and exigent crises. And people did have some expectations for a shorter time frame when they thought the Bernie movement was going to be more successful. And so how do you balance that? Like, how do you say things take time, but also look how quickly the MAGA movement sprung up, or things take time, but we had this moment during the pandemic where 50 million people lost their healthcare and nobody seemed to want to exploit that opportunity to push for more. What is the Naomi Klein, when you take advantage of a crisis, what's it called? Not disaster capitalism. It's like the phenomenon where you shock doctrine. Oh, yeah. It's only shock doctrine for the right, and it's never shock doctrine for the left. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I'm just trying to think a little creatively. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that I think about the same things. I like the answer that I came to was like, the labor movement is the thing. The labor movement is the permanent institution that we need to build that can then take advantage of those moments. The labor movement is the institution. And, I write in my book and other places about, like, I don't want unions to be adjuncts to the Democratic Party, but I want them to focus on organizing workers, so growing the labor movement is where my alternative path of focus for labor needs to be. So not being plugged in as an adjunct to the Democratic Party, but instead focusing on growing themselves,
Well, what do you think of like Workers Strike Back and some of these efforts that do seem to have this relationship with at least local party politics, like with Shama Sawant obviously being a city councilwoman and achieving some significant goals there, but then now turning that over into a labor organization?
I think the thing is, if you're going to build organizations and you're going to build mass movements, you got to be able to show and prove. Like, you got to have the people. You got to have. Shama Sawant can say things, and I don't know Shama Sawant, but like, a union has one great thing, which is it has members, and it can be like, we have 50,000 people here, and those people carry political weight, and they carry power, and they carry labor power, and they carry economic power, and you can use that for progressive goals. So any organization that you want to build, it's a show and prove situation, and like that goes for labor too. That's why I'm always like, we need to focus on organizing more people, because labor is too weak today to accomplish the things I want it to accomplish. But I feel like we're kind of on parallel We're sort of seeing the same thing.
I want to bring the tracks together because when you say organized labor, I'm like, great, yes, 100%.
Right.
But when I say organize the Labor Party, it feels like I'm getting back, no, I don't think so. I don't want to participate.
I mean,
and
it's
to me, it's like both of those things are mutually beneficial, and we need each other.
Right. I mean, we can have a Labor Party, but it's like, how much energy are we putting into the Labor Party? And
don't worry about it. The energy isn't coming. The energy isn't coming from the labor movement. The energy is coming from all of the energy people are already putting into electoral politics with the two-party system, neither of whom are working for them. Instead, funnel that energy.
What's wrong with DSA then?
DSA is not a party, and they don't want to be a party, and they want to. I'm sorry, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but they have demonstrated a greater desire to pat themselves on the back of the accomplishment of the squad members existing in Congress than to actually using them to affect change now that they're there. And it wasn't even the DSA. I mean, I don't want to take away from DSA members that helped them get elected, knocking doors and things like that, but it wasn't even a DSA project. It was Cenk Uygur and Kyle Kalinski's personal pet project. And they managed to accomplish more in terms of getting DSA members in office than the DSA did themselves. So it's not that I'm trying to diminish the DSA, but there is a kind of weird smearing of the Greens and third-party efforts, even though there's overlap. What's his name? In New York, whose name just flew out of my head. Tall, black guy, gay, good-looking. Jabari Brisport, sorry.
Jabari Brisport.
Jabari is both DSA and Green, right?
Yeah.
But for some reason, it becomes this weird antagonistic thing.
I make a point of not getting involved in any DSA arguments, but it does seem like if you want to build a third party, right? DSA, it probably will proceed along the lines that DSA is actually doing, meaning you're not going to start running with president. Yeah. You're going to start on.
Well, of course not. And I would love for that. But that's what socialist work, Fight Back is trying to be, an alternative to DSA that's more adversarial and willing to be critical of the Democratic Party than the DSA has become, especially in the post-squad era. So and they're hoping to grow and to actually become and support political parties in the way that DSA has, I would argue, disempowered itself by not doing. But, I'm rooting for the DSA. I wish the DSA would say I'm going to be involved in party politics. I'd be like, great, the DSA is exciting again. But instead, they're just a place where I log in and I see they're talking shit about me on the Slack.
I mean, I don't attend DSA meetings. I support them from afar. But there is a quality in any political party, which is there's going to be a lot of people, no matter what, who are who can actually do stuff. There's going to be a core of people who are I'll dedicate my life to building this party. But a lot of the mass of voters is going to be who can actually do stuff. So until you can elevate a third party to the point when they are on the unions can't do stuff,
power. Hamilton. That's an argument against your own project.
That's what my book is about.
So why would you poo-poo another project when people can use that exact same argument to diminish the work that you're trying to do?
I don't have a strong opinion on it. I'm if you build it and it's great, I will join.
No, that's not enough. That's not. When you say we need to organize, I don't say, well, if you build it, I will come. I will say, how can I help? That's what I'd say. I'd say, how can I help? And if I'm not pro-union on this show, I would get dragged, and rightly so. But you're allowed to be oh, well, show me when you're already in power, and then maybe I'll throw you a vote. When it comes to third parties, it's absurd. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.